So, welcome everyone to the talk on making magic magical. Planning to cover a few different um, aspects with this, and then leave some time at the end for any level of discussion, people sharing things that they worked, anything that you wished had been in greater detail that other people might be interested in going into. So, if there's something that occurs to you, please write it down, and I'm planning on about 15 or so minutes at the end to open up the floor, basically. So, magic. Magic being one of the key elements of a fantasy RPG that distinguishes it from other kinds of RPGs. Um, there are different ways to emphasize this, from the mechanical to the literary and the different kinds of things that players will experience, as well as what they will interact with the world and also what the characters will experience. So we have multiple levels: game mechanics, player experience, character experience. You can draw on different sources to do this, but a lot of it comes to how does magic feel in a given setting. This is not so much an issue where there are right and wrong answers in a lot of these cases, because it's just what kind of tone you're going for. We'll see later there's the trope of magic having a cost. And that can be simply time and experience. That can be souls and blood and things that are more dire. Anything in between, and all of these things take place in fantasy RPG. More on that later. Most of my experience with this is that magic connects to something grander, more expansive. This might be older. These are things that came before us. Typical tropes of fantasy RPGs is what came before is powerful. There is history and weight behind it. And one thing that I like to do is draw on our real world past and culture for how I inform what I do with magic. It can be greater power in the case of the 5e Warlock. Sometimes it's tapping into a power source beyond what you could control. It's not that you're even trying to. It may not even know you're there. That then goes to the Cthulhu mythos and creatures whose existence drives people beyond comprehension and more than they can handle. One of my friends at one point described the Detect Thoughts spell as not a conversation, but diving into an ocean. This was a view of other people as being there's so much to a human. Diving in, and it's more about seeing what you can get from it in this rush of experience rather than the ways that I'd previously thought about it, where it's sifting through, like finding nuggets of gold or anything like that. She had a different view, and I hadn't been expecting it, but as a fellow player in the game, but she gave a new explanation, and it sort of opened up how I would think of different spells from other perspectives. But magic, regardless, tends to have a wonder to it. A lot of it is things that are impossible, make it happen. Modern magicians, card tricks, anything. We know that what they're doing is, in some sense, possible. They're performing illusions, they're doing tricks, they're doing things that we see them do, but there's some element of it that makes it seem impossible to us. Well, in a fantasy world, they're doing it. You can create something out of nothing. Tolkien sees this as a secondary world, and a quotation, it's viewing a far-off, unvisited island, or seeing the towers of a distant city gleaming in a sunlit mist. He's talking about subcreation, his view for what it is to create a believable setting. And here we're trying to make the impossible, magic, into something that's believable. This is something shared between game master and player. Magic can be experienced on both sides of the DM screen. And it's also something that our characters and ourselves can experience. We have access to it, and sometimes this is a character having that wonder. Sometimes for the character it may be mundane, but for the player, it's still a wonderful experience. And then the other thing is magic doing the impossible can seem to be a shortcut. Back to 5e examples, the message spell or sending, being able to instantly communicate with just another person. Well, nowadays we have telephones, but this goes beyond that in a setting where they don't have those. It would be viewed as impossible, but with magic you can do it. However, magic can ground us in a world rather than bypassing or shortcutting it. And that can be part of the intent, is setting the context where you do this impossible thing, but that makes it more believable in your setting. So there, a book by James George Fraser in the 1890s, or published in 1890, The Golden Bough, goes into many different cultures' views of magical thinking, the ideas that people have around magic. This was a survey of different beliefs around the world, and what it was termed was sympathetic magic. This is the idea that thoughts, words, and wishes can produce direct physical effects on the world. He categorized this with two main ideas, the law of contagion and the law of similarity. And this is using modern views of historical magic to create a greater connection with players and what they're going to understand about magic by leaning into things that people often, whether it's subconsciously or ideas they've been exposed to before, but perhaps not in this context, we can tap into this, and it's an easier path for understanding how magic would work in a given world. The law of contagion is once in contact, always in contact. There was an experiment done that looked at how strong this effect was, where they, with a whole series of, with a number of people, they took a survey on what kind of drink they liked, whether it be orange juice, apple juice, water, anything like that, poured them a glass of it, and then held up a sterile cockroach, put it in the glass. They pulled the cockroach back out, handed it to the person to ask them to look at the cockroach, count all of its legs, see that it was intact, and then from the same container that they poured the glass, so separate glass of water, they poured another glass of that preferred beverage and asked people to rate whether they wanted to drink that liquid or something like it. What was previously their favorite drink became their least likely to drink. There had been no contact with that cockroach. One of the reasons that they studied disgust in this instead of some more pleasant emotion is disgust is relatively easy to see. Stronger reaction, so it was easier for them to reach that, to conclude what was coming out of it. So that law of contagion, because there was a cockroach in other water, this new water is not something I like so much. Other examples, with a shirt that was worn by someone who a person disliked, and then laundered, someone wouldn't want to wear the shirt. The opposite effect can be, and there is a podcast, Magical Thinking from the Imaginary Worlds podcast series, where they mention that the reverse of this is the boyfriend's hoodie is more comfortable. People feel better wearing it. So it's not just about disgust. You can have positive emotions associated as well. But then why does an athlete's jersey, one that they'd worn, have greater value? It's because it had been in contact, and once in contact, always in contact. The law of similarity is the image means the object. It's like causes like, and effect resembles its cause. Three different ways to say a similar thing. One of the examples for this is that an amethyst, often purple colored, there was belief in the ancient Greeks and the Romans that drinking from amethyst would remove the effects of intoxication. That belief was so strong that even the word amethyst stems from this idea. The nymph, one of the companions of Dionysus, was the Maenad, a goddess of drunkenness. So amethyst is the name. A is anti or opposite. So non-drunkenness is the name of the crystal that is used today. Now, is it that there are actual properties that do anything? No. Maybe it's that in a semi-translucent pink or purple colored crystal, water looks like wine and you can drink more of it without getting drunk. There may be something to that. But in any case, the belief was that the crystal was doing the magic. Gems in Dungeons and Dragons. Diamond has its own special place, but so could any other number of crystals. That's something that can be present in spell components. Anything that has a material component or a focus. The idea is that using these things matter is present in games. We can emphasize There are other examples where, say, a voodoo doll, it touches on both ideas of law of contagion and the law of similarity, because you use something like a fingernail clipping or a piece of hair, always in contact, so anything you do to the doll, the image resembles the cause. Whatever is happening to the person that that voodoo doll is connected with. So thinking of things that are magical, whether it's from history or seeing magic that is present, uh, seeing magic inspires creativity in people. It's no wonder that when we're playing these games, we want to do creative things. We're seeking solutions. We're looking at things in a new light. There's other studies that have to do with the perception of magic. A number of children, first from, I believe it was 4 through 6, and then a second time repeated with similar effects through 6 through 8 year olds, where children either watched a movie of just something mundane, ordinary, or they watched a movie that included magic in it. Children who watched a movie that showed magic performed better on tasks of creativity, like drawing an impossible thing, compared with children who watched a movie without magic. So magic inspires us. We can lean into that. Look for creative solutions. Look for ways to emphasize the magic and depict it. There is another line from Tolkien where fantasy starts out with an advantage and arresting strangeness. This is for the advantage of believability, where the strangeness of magic is not a detriment, but a benefit. You're able to emphasize something that takes you aback and makes you wonder at it, gives you a sense of awe. Literary techniques would favorably have us use all of the senses. One of my favorite techniques is using archaic words. It's not just a drink of some healing liquid. It's a potion, or it might be an unguent. It might be a poultice. You can apply older words to put people in a mindset where they're thinking of medieval and magic and dragons off the edge of the map. I don't see that in an atlas that's sitting in my car. I see that in older maps that are hand-drawn and colored. So you want to have a mindset where people are thinking of things that remind them of other magical things. You can heighten and exaggerate depiction to emphasize what magic is present. And another method, along with that archaic communication to other people, is communicate in ways that make the circumstances clear to both the player, but would also be understood by their character. One of my favorite ways to say two things at once is to not only explain what the player knows, but give the character the context where they would understand it too. Often useful for explanations when players are concerned about using out-of-game knowledge. It's entirely possible to tell people things that also explain how their character has this knowledge as well. So it bypasses that hesitance to begin with. There's an example I had where, let me find that. One of the examples I use for communicating on multiple levels at once was drawing attention for the difference between the living and the undead in the Shadowfell when the heroes had just moved in, just been teleported there. There's a ghoul snarling a command to its group, "Get the beaters." This is in reference to the living heroes' heartbeats. Keeping the audience in mind, I've communicated simultaneously to players and characters that something, 1, intelligent, 2, uses verbal communication, 3, with other members of its group, 4, knows the characters are there, 5, in a place where their presence is noteworthy, 6, because they're alive, and importantly 7, it's out to get them. Layers of different magic, they teleported to another plane. There's something undead that is speaking and slavering it with its jaws, in fact, wanting to get to them. So it's trying to emphasize these things in ways that keep the action moving, that also make sense to the players. Gone a little out of order here. That's okay. These archaic terms, if you've ever heard the phrase, "the past is a foreign country," they do things differently there. That's L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between. It's the opening line. being able to bridge that divide can be something completely non-magical. The practices of farming were very different when they were concerned about subsistence and making sure you could make it through the winter compared to maximizing profit margins. But also belief in magic was different. There's a game that I haven't had the chance to play yet, but I've heard good things about it, Ars Magica, which has tried to take steps for making magic work the way people thought that it would. This is one where players can build their own spells. You're combining these different syllables that each are using elements, fire, water, wind, earth, not the periodic table we know today. And using the element as one base and the effect, the school of magic, D&D has those, but it's less prevalent than in Ars Magica, to create new spells and effects. And then the farther removed you are from your area of expertise and the different kinds of effects you're putting together, the more difficult it is to cast the spell to get the effect that you want. But nonetheless, it is possible, and you can try any number of impossible things if only the dice are in your favor and if you have a strong enough grasp of magic. We don't want to go so far into magic doing impossible things that the Star Trek technobabble applies. Arthur C. Clarke's quotation, third law, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. We want the magic to make sense. There has to be some level that connects of there were steps that are understandable to be taken. Not everything needs to be understood. There's plenty of monsters that should be able to use magic in unexpected, unanticipated ways that can heighten the wonder and the curiosity about the world instead of pulling people out and seeing this is a game mechanic or feeling like something has been cheated. There is a fine line to walk in between those two as a tension. But if something is perfectly known, you strip away mystery, you strip away wonder. But if it is perfectly unknown, players don't have access to it. And then that's something where their character is in a world where they don't see what's going on. It's not a plausible circumstance. You want to balance the elements of uncertainty and the game mechanics that people have to know, as well as the familiarity that characters have. There are tropes where the barbarian doesn't trust magic, wants nothing to do with it, and is in the party with a wizard. And today we have folklore and superstition. Some people believe superstitions, some don't. Knock on wood, you don't have to believe that it does anything, but there is cultural significance to it. These things come in as well. You can have characters that do things without knowing why, or without having, without understanding the context to it, but in a world where there is magic, these things can work anyway. One of the ideas that I've toyed with is using humorism, the belief of the four humors of blood, choler, phlegm, and black bile, as means of healing for clerics in Dungeons and Dragons, healers in all other kinds of games. Even today, feeding a cold and starving a fever can connect back to some of the beliefs of humorism. Anything cold and wet was associated with phlegm, the beliefs that if you ate certain foods, you could restore balance to your body. Being able to tie into these historical ideas, but giving them new life today, gives people historical context, which makes it believable in those cases, and gives them a method or a mechanism, and that often makes people want to explore. You're able to see how things can go together, and then just like people would travel to the coast for their health, this was humorism, you might have people wondering if spells will work differently in the desert compared to on the coastline. There is no reason why it couldn't. Why not? I mean, ley lines. This is another idea where there are areas where magic is stronger or weaker, and it's a conduit for magical essence. Kobold Press has ley line magic, and they have maps where ley lines are present in their setting in Midgard. This is something that could be used in other games, or it could be a theory, an explanation of why magic works, even if it isn't accepted or understood by characters in the world. It's a lot about what sources you draw from, what you choose to use, what ends up being true or not or understood. You can tie all of these things in. one of the other elements of history is contrasting alchemy with science. Alchemy was not only about turning lead into gold or turning base metals into gold. It was about purity, purity of spirit, of mind, but also it had jealously guarded secrets. And this is one of the reasons why people worked on things independently, but then they hoarded their information instead of the ideals, at least, of modern peer review, publishing discoveries, and repeatability of various anything that people will learn. You want to publish, you want your work to be out there. We see wizards in Dungeons and Dragons, some of which, Wizard's Tower, locked away, nobody knows what's going on up there. Other times, the books, the lore, these are things where it is sharing and magical discovery. People will end up putting both traditions, and that's okay. Different individuals will have a different approach to it. Do you want to take on an apprentice or do you not? But with a lot of this, these were all in eras before mass production. One of the books that I sometimes draw inspiration from is J.D. Lamplighter's series, Prospero's Daughter. In this, there is one portion of it that is set in the modern day, but it refers to events happening hundreds of years ago, and the Industrial Revolution only becoming possible because of the binding of demons and the restraint of wild and willful magic. This is a way that you could have all myths be true in a given setting. Magic doesn't need to behave the same way every time. And the way that you the way that you cast a spell and the effects the spell has should be unique to the people who cast them, even if two different people apprenticed to the same magician. Individuals are different, and in medieval settings, this is an era where almost everything was handcrafted. You will have individual touches, and we see the influence of this in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything with the recommendation to allow players to do customization, to flavor their spells in their own ways with color and description, more than only choosing whether you're using a component focus or a component pouch, an arcane focus, or listed spell materials. You can do more than that. Some of this personalization can also be down to individual beliefs, or not beliefs, individual secrecy, getting back to that idea in alchemy where people were guarding their secrets from one another. We have some of that in the modern day. You had different, whether it be euphemisms, different terms used, including, I found mixed sources to this, but the idea that the ingredients from the witches in the Scottish play all referred to plants, things that are written down in ways that would not be readily understood by just anyone, but the person who wrote them would still be able to know what they meant by the fillet of a fenny snake, or if Eye of Newt was a literal eye, or was this a reference to a plant? Adder's fork, blindworm's sting. Different things that could be references to parts of a plant in a given locality instead of an actual animal parts. There is a source for the idea that salt of crab's eyes was a term for calcium acetate in an essay on 18th century chemistry. So you have another one listed in that book for unrefined acetone is tincture of coral. What else can we do to make different terms in spell scrolls, in wizard books, in the tomes used by wizards in their spell books? This may as well be a cipher in many cases, rather than an easily repeatable recipe. We have all kinds of astrology, folklore, superstition that gets used, and we can tie that in with. Sorry, lost my place a bit. Okay, yes. So folklore and the individual ways of writing things down, different regions have their own folklore. When we have Tolkien once again in the Shire, it's derivation for golf being knocking a goblin's head off and having it go down a gopher hole. You have all these different. No, that was apologies. That looks like that was out of place in my notes. We have references and we have symbolism. Okay, back to whether Eye of Newt is real, Toe of Frog is real. Symbolism is present all throughout the spell components in D&D. I need to scroll a bit. This is sometimes used to humorous effect. Legumes being part of Gust of Wind, for instance. Other times it's less obvious references. Keep scrolling in my notes. Yeah, symbolic representation. The spell Aid uses a strip of white cloth. This is a bandage, but no one's describing actually performing any bandaging during a battle when it's cast. Confusion uses 3 nutshells. It's the shell game, where you put a pea under one shell and you move everything around. So some of these are funny, some of these are modern references, like using dried carrot for dark vision. There is no benefit to consuming extra carrots to get better night vision. Unless you are vitamin deficient, it's not going to do anything for you. That was radar. But these same kinds of things that are references in spell, this goes back once again to the modern psychology and law of similarity and law of contagion. This is the law of similarity where this resembles the larger effect that you're causing. This is something that's used in Patrick Rothfuss's Kingkiller Chronicle, where you can make bindings and you lose less magical energy between things that are closely bound, things that have a close association, and things that are farther bound. You can sometimes require multiple steps. Rothfuss even invented a way to talk about entropy by calling it slippage. So with his books, there is entropy in magic. You lose energy when you try to perform more steps. He found a way to talk about entropy that wasn't anachronistic. That's one of the other things that I'm trying to do when I communicate to players in ways that their characters can understand, is to avoid anachronism. To me, that feels like it pulls people out of the game, although sometimes it's necessary, and we are, after all, playing a game. You need to be able to talk about mechanics. I, for one, have an appreciation of the fact that it works differently whether you're rolling 1d12 for a great axe or 2d6 for a sword. It can be fairly similar, but the distinction can make a difference. You can use game mechanics to support this. My preference is to not draw attention to that during the course of a game. Let me make sure. I believe I might have passed over a bit here. All right, going in the opposite direction from using names to obfuscate and confuse what we're referring to, there's also the idea of true names. There was an unearthed arcana where it was wizards who could use true names in casting that I don't believe ever went anywhere with Wizards of the Coast, but it is still prevalent in fantasy. The Earthsea trilogy talks about this. In that language, Draconic is it is not possible to lie in the original dragon tongue. However, dragons are so good at it, they can say anything they wish anyway. Tapping into these ideas of wanting to know something thoroughly and completely, and also to solve a problem if you only had just the right word. The real world is more complicated, but this is a desire. What if I could just explain it the right way and be done with a problem? True naming is this kind of idea. It's having something that is the essence of the thing. It's the epitome of it. The Dresden Files series includes the idea of true names with a twist I hadn't seen before, where people are so changeable that even hearing a wizard's true name, it's not going to do you any good later on. This is useful for the author, but it's also a neat way to think about characters continuing to change and grow and remake themselves. And it's a useful way to have limitations in the system. The Dresden Files RPG has its own separate system where the more magical you are, the more constrained you are. It uses the fate system. Jumping to that part in my the fate system where mortal characters have increased freedom and supernatural characters, whether you are half and half or whether it is purely supernatural, have to obey the rules more. This fits with the ideas of creatures of the Feywild having to follow rules, vampires who need to count things. This is represented in game mechanics by having complications or compels. Being a wizard in the mundane world has this cost where you're partly in one world, partly in the other, and you need to fuel this magic somehow. Having that fuel, or having that compulsion, makes players act in certain ways if they want to use all of their abilities. So then it reinforces the setting of the game by aligning the mechanics with the fiction in a way that's able to be understood. At different levels through the game. And once more, this ties into the idea of magic having a cost or a price. If any of you have seen it was originally on Twitter, this shop has everything my heart desires. Every item comes with a price. Yes, I know how shops work. Maybe more than you expect to pay. I know how US taxes work too. The shopkeeper says, I'm trying to tell you that I'm evil and offering these wares with no regard for the harm they will do. I know what capitalism is too. Magic having a price is a common trope. Warlock deals do this. The price can be more than just time and energy that a wizard would have to put into learning. That is more the academic side of things. But it can also be just an innate power. So these are three different common sources of where magic comes from. Through study, through deals, also through study, through deals. Where did this go? Innate power. This may be being the scion of a deity. It may be something that naturally arises or is sporadic and unpredictable. These tropes occur. We can use them and enjoy them, and it would lead to different ideas of what magic is and how it works. If you only had one or another, then the magics, it will lead people to view magic a certain way. Magic having a cost can also show up in the using of magic each time it is used. Dark Sun uses this where magic drains the world. The world is largely desolate desert because magic takes life out of the world. In the 7th Sea, there are Sorciers de Porte casters. Their magic lets them rip a hole in the fabric of the world and walk through. They teleport, but the world bleeds. A villain does this and the world pays the cost. When a hero does it, they pay the cost. Anyone who's going to be in my 7th Sea game, there is a sorcerer you can play, and you can see the mechanic for yourself. So you don't necessarily want to lean in too heavily to magic having a cost if the cost is too high, but that can be an interesting element of the system as well. Having that cost is one of the ways to have a balance between what is impossible and what is magic doing the impossible, but also how do you bear the cost of that and still have a balanced system. Unlike in movies and television, there is no writer's room behind this. There is no script. There isn't an author with an outline to describe things. So we need to have things work in a way that the players will know what to expect and have fun with the system rather than be at the whim of someone who really should have just written their book. They can understand the game mechanics, and quite usually it's easy to work in magic having a cost with having to pay a cost mechanically in the game, whether that is hit points, whether that is dice. As before, Freedom in the Dresden Files RPG, you can make things follow so that when the character feels that they have a cost, the player also feels they have a cost as well. You're aligning the mechanics with the fiction. And then one of the other elements here with the wonder of magic, you've probably heard the phrase familiarity breeds contempt. This is a balance to be struck between being surprised at what magic can do, but also knowing what tone you want in your setting. Is this high magic where everyone knows how it works? is this low magic where magic is largely unheard of. There are ways to go in between this and have magic be pervasive. It's spread throughout, but always at a low level. This is one of those things where it's useful to be able to communicate to people what their character should expect from this. Because if as a player, I understand how the delayed blast fireball works, my character may never have seen it before. And it's in the setting for how that should work, but it's up to communication at the table to understand how to interact with that. So then that leads to asymmetry working in our favor, where if players can read the entire book but not have all of the access to understanding of magic, if there are some things that are only on the GM side of the screen, where they're still following rules, they're still using a system, but it's not accessible to the players, you can emulate that bit of wonder and uncertainty that a player has with what their character has, tying those emotional states together and getting to experience it through the description at the table and in the moment. So to recap some of this, which has been a little meandering, thank you for bearing with me. We have the feeling of magic. It is wondrous, it is powerful, it ties into something bigger than any one character. And the ways that we can make the character get some sense of that, but also the player, is to tie into modern psychology with the law of contagion, where once in contact is always in contact, the law of similarity, where like causes like, and the increased creativity that comes with thinking about and participating in things that feel magical. Expect that creativity, avoid overload, but try to draw out new ways to make things work, novel solutions. But then, opposite of what is novel, use historical references. Use it for setting up the magic, use it for explaining the magic, and use it as a shorthand so that people have a sense of the world that they're in. This can be anything from how would magic be used, how would it change a setting if all you had to do was cast prestidigitation or mending on a broken object instead of taking it back to a blacksmith. You can change the way magic works in games, and you can also reimagine how history would go or what kind of jobs would be different, or is there reason not to do this? It can be explained in world building, it can be explained in spell selection and accessible options at the table. You can use the names of things along with that when names are archaic and when they draw on old cultures, old ideas. A little bit of pushing people outside of what they are innately familiar with, but also using old enough ideas. Some of the roots are still there. This was something Tolkien did in his work, where he thought that people would have a sense of what these words meant, as being a linguist, even if they couldn't define them all for themselves. We can use that as well, using older terms for things instead of more current or modern terms, especially when we're in a fantasy setting. And then we can consider the different ways that types of magic should feel different. Innate magic, understood or poorly understood, is going to feel different than that which was ideal, even though there can be a lack of comprehension in both. A wild magic sorcerer who just comes into their power is going to have a different experience with the unknown side of it than someone who has signed away their soul to an archdevil as a warlock. They have power as well, and they probably don't know, they probably are aware that they don't always get the better end of this deal, depending on that relationship. But they still might want to get the most out of it that they can. And then study is opposed to either one of these things, where it is the as well understood as possible, pushing yourself to learn more, and trying to master something through effort and energy rather than having it be innate or rather than having it become instantaneous with signing something away. We want to use magic balancing what is possible and what is the impossible nature of magic with the understandable and how well grasped something is with game mechanics, also keeping that balance of players having a level of parity with one another. So that is that overview, and that concludes my discussion portion. Are there any elements where people wanted to talk about that more, or anything you wanted to share that of what you've been able to do in your own games to make magic? The other thing I'll do is I'll post some links here for sources that I had drawn on.
Those should probably go in the artist's alley.
That's a good point. That's a better place for it, and that's where I'll put them. Thank you.
I'll say one thing that I've done with magic once or twice is I will actually have mages or such who actually do practice, say, like sleight of hand in addition to their magecraft, because then they can always claim that, like, plausible deniability of, like, oh, I'm not really casting magic. See, here's the coin behind my ear. And then you can naturally, like, lead into spells or such with sleight of hand, because if everybody's expecting you to do, say, like a pick a card, any card, and then suddenly a lightning bolt comes out of their hand that is real, tangible, and dangerous, it's interesting juxtaposition. I also might have come up with the term parlor mages to describe people who have no talent but appear to be mages.
That is not where I thought parlor mages was going to go. That is fun and interesting in its own right. What it made me think of right away was the Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell book, where one wizard is trying to bring magic back into respectability, very much in a hierarchical class setting. And another one is, and this is one of the only people in this setting who has access to magic, and another one just kind of, he works at it, but he lucks into it to a greater extent. And yes, by Susanna Clark. Thank you, Dux. And their partnership and conflict between them, and so much more. Fun views of magic there.
So I can speak to something that I've done that I thought was pretty interesting with magic before.
Please.
This is a short story thing I wrote once, and I'm still not entirely sure. I just had the idea and wanted to see where, the thought experiment would go with, two things that you've mentioned, with magic having a cost and magic having strong associations. And so I wrote a little short story about this world in which the way that magic was cast is you would have these mementos with, strong emotions, strong memories related to them. And you would use them to cast magic related to those memories and those emotions. But in doing so, you'd burn up those memories and emotions. So you might, and you get to choose. You get to choose. Am I going to burn up the memory and just be left with this unknowing emotion whenever I look at this thing? Or am I going to burn away the emotion, have the memory, and feel nothing about it? Like, which cost is better for me? Which is acceptable? And in which cases am I willing to sacrifice either of those things for this magic? That's basically it. I just thought it was neat.
It is.
And, deeply up.
Your comment on the idea of superstitions and, bringing that into play, I think was really insightful and made me think of, like, what are other things that we say are, like, lucky? Like, maybe, like, you must have a cat on board. And, like, if the cat isn't on board, then that's a great way to start messing with people.
We are once more entering the realm of circles of salt being used. If anyone has seen the image of a self-driving car that is trapped in a circle, is if the training is it's not supposed to cross the white line, and you put it in a white line that is circular, then you'd be able to contain the self-aware metal beast within the circle of salt. But then having that idea of salt and the properties it has with throwing a pinch of salt over your shoulder is another one. So tie all of those together. and you get more superstition that can take effect. Even something as simple as saying "bless you" when
So your
someone
soul
sneezes.
doesn't leave your body.
What Margaret and I have taken to doing is if I have allergies and I'm sneezing multiple times, she will count down on a D4 before when she will stop saying "bless you." So yeah, about your soul leaving your body.
I had a question, Joel.
Mhm.
Mostly, I'm kind of in a curious department. You seem to have a robust set of knowledge, obviously, about the topic. Is there anything that you particularly dislike or occasionally feel like magic systems get wrong after they're explained to you?
I don't have a good example for that. I think it's more about context. And there may be a time when the tone doesn't fit what I have felt like it's supposed to be going for. So for a lot of this, one of the criticisms of 4th edition is that people had felt like the things that were being done by martial characters and wizard characters didn't feel different enough. You can see the differences. They are there, but it will come a lot more down to description rather than to mechanically what's occurring on the table. So that's one where there was a little bit of incongruity between feeling like a wizard and being a fighter that can do the impossible. It's like, well, both of these are superhuman, and you can just recharacterize how it works. That also is something that could be appreciated if what I'm looking for is that level of parity and being able to do something where any sufficiently advanced fighter is indistinguishable from magic as well. So that's not so much wrong as it is if I was expecting a different tone to it, I would be unsatisfied with it. I started in 4th edition, still love 4th edition. So that wasn't so much a problem, but I can see where that criticism.
Okay, thank you.
If I could jump on like that answer, like what in
Please.
your opinion would be the like not exactly the balance itself, because that's not a useful question, but what would contribute to a balance, especially in a game where you have characters who are supposed to understand how the magic system works, but also maintain that element of wonder and mystery and unknowableness? You mentioned it before when you mentioned like the asymmetry of knowledge between the game master and the players, but I was wondering, is there anything else in your opinion that could help contribute to that?
One
Outside
of the things that
of
I've done,
you know,
yeah.
And maybe you've already covered this because I came in late to the talk, but I'm looking specifically for how much of this is down to mechanics versus flavoring and presentation. Yeah.
So one of the things that I really like in a game is where someone gets a dawning realization or is able to test and then understand or verify that something works the way that they thought it does. A mechanical side that I've done to this, less about spell casting or anything like that, but what I'll use with monsters. Sometimes monsters with magical abilities, so this can work for that as well. I'll have somebody roll. If they're trying to learn about a demon, it might be a religion roll. If it's going to be a creature from another plane, it's an arcana roll. And mapping to the result of their roll, I will tell them what page of the monster manual to look up for a number of seconds. Whatever they can read on that page and recall in that time, I let them tell other people. But it's like, okay, you can look at that page for, you rolled a 19, you get 19 seconds. Whatever information you can get out of it, that's what your character knows. So this is using the mechanics and in very much we are playing a game. It draws attention to that, but then we go back into the world and their character, they know this because of their own past history, the work that they've done. They put they might have taken it. They usually it's gated behind having either expertise in it or just proficiency in it, really. So it's, you made the choice to be proficient. I let proficient characters roll on this. And so this is your reward, is you get to learn this information in game terms. And then usually what I'll do is I'll privately message the person if it's a remote game and tell them to please tell other characters what your character would say now that you have been able to look at this. This works even better if I'm using monsters that aren't known by the other players. Or else they may remember, some demons have this, some don't. I don't remember if this thing. But other examples of that can be they don't necessarily know what a creature is doing, but if they're always staying within 30 feet of something else, well, probably there's a reason for that. Maybe it's a spell, maybe it's an aura, maybe something is happening. So being able to look at it from that sense, and that's something the character and player can observe, is able to let them first get the idea that there is something to it, especially when it would otherwise be disadvantageous for them to make these choices. And you can go through that using explanation of the monster. If it's something that's not acting in a clever way, you're able to depict like, oh, the thing that hurt it last, it's going after that, even if that opens it up to an attack of opportunity. Or if it's looking back and forth, you can draw attention to the fact it knows there's someone there. It's going to do this other course of action anyway, taking additional risk, moving out of position, telling the players that there is a different motivation to what it is doing. And you can apply that with magic as well. That may not be directly answering, but that's my immediate thought.